if I share this.
Love it.
Okay, and there's that. It's open house day in ABT metrics land. Um, let's see. First off, before we even get started, anybody got any thoughts about last week with Dr. Osterholm? Um, anybody hit with any deep impressions from that session? That was pretty dang interesting, I think. It was very tight and efficient that first half hour. Um, Shirley, you got any thoughts on Dr. Osterholm's
Well, I
remarks?
think that he has basically um, he's come to some conclusions about himself and about the community that he seems more open to sharing.
Hmm.
Hmm.
When people wake up, it's they get the sleep out of their eyes. All of a sudden they're at a very different place.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to his book comes out September 2nd, so in the next 2 to 3 weeks he should be popping up a bunch in the media. Interesting last week we traded a couple emails after his appearance with us, and he was on the next day he was on KQED here, the I think PBS station in San Francisco, I guess. And it was a really interesting and good interview in that it was pure ABT. He said that whatever it is, the Pediatric Association for decades has been in close alignment with the CDC, but now there's been a complete divide. CDC is now going the opposite direction, and we don't agree with them. Therefore, everyone should be aware of how far out of line CDC is now with all these sorts of things. And I guess what really hit me was a couple days later on Bill Maher's show. He had what's the guy's name? Andrew Huberman, I think, or something from Stanford University, who's a big kind of healthy foods guru. And he was on there. And granted, the guy's charismatic and he's smart and everything else like that and credentialed. Um, but God damn it, he didn't say one gutsy word about the RFK. In fact, Bill Maher brought up RFK Jr. and he said, well, he's kind of got some good ideas and he's got some things and that's the very thing that we hit on a little bit with Osterholm, which is, do you want to change things in the world? If you do, you better understand narrative and you better understand that every time you mix the message and say, well, there's some good and there's some bad. I mean, yes, you're being honest. I guess you're being there's your problem. Don't be such a scientist. Do you want to just throw out all the information and go down the tubes by being unable to make a point? Or do you want to work judiciously and not make any mention of the fact that Kennedy is supporting getting rid of food coloration or something like that, which is maybe a nice thing, but it's so trivial compared to the gargantuan things that he's doing. And the problem with narrative is that it's not like science think. It's not proportionalities. If you do, here's some good things and here's some bad things, the audience can't add up and realize the bad things are way more than the good things. They just hear a mixed message. Oh, well, this and that. And unfortunately, it's your responsibility if you want to try and make any progress to keep the things pretty singular, which is here's what the guy's doing, and this is really, really bad, and we're not going to talk about the fact that he's taking food coloration out of products. But so many people in the science world do not get that, and I just have
But
been.
they don't have, Randy, the problem is they don't have the language yet to talk about this kind of usurpation of a few good words that allow that where you give this guy a pass. All right? They're kind of Faustian trade-offs, and you are
Oh
coming
yeah,
in at the bad side of the bargain. All right?
yeah,
And that is what we don't have the language to talk about. Are you willing to trade off food coloring for your life? Okay?
right,
You would
right.
be putting it into the kind of context where you just said, where you are willing to give them a pass on food coloring. but you're not willing to take the pass on vaccines because you can die that way. All
Right.
right.
Exactly. Well, and so there's a strategy to it. And to me, it's more than the language, it's the absence of leadership. The science world has no effective leadership. There's no voice out there that's saying these sorts of things. That was the whole premise with Osterholm, the way I introduced him, the whole reason I was drawn to him in 2020 was he was the only guy who got on national media and said, "We're not speaking with a singular voice." He said one voice was his words, but it's the same thing that we have with the ABT, which is you've got to have the singular narrative. You've got to hone these things down into clear singular narratives. And it just hit me. It was really, I think, important in the middle of that discussion. It hit me this catchphrase from Frank Danielle, our old screenwriting instructor, which is your story is only as good as your villain is evil. And every time you say something nice about your villain, your story gets weaker and people get less interested in it. You know, take a look at the most extreme movies and they are 98% evil in the villain. And then they throw in that one little element of spice there that, oh, but he did pick up the cat and take it out of the middle of the highway or something like that. One tiny little micro bit of humanity, but you don't go ahead and throw out a bunch of things like that because then that's what obfuscation's about, and that's what Steve Bannon and all of them understand, and that's what they're doing right now. Is they're doing a very skilled job, and Trump is doing it to a T. He is tossing out little bits and pieces of, oh, maybe he is kind of a nice guy. Oh, look at that. Yesterday, he wouldn't say anything bad about Taylor Swift and Kelsey and you know, their engagement, and he said horrible things in the past. But he's being coached now by, people saying, just go ahead and say a nice thing about them. It's not going to cost you anything, and it'll water down the opposition because they can't vilify you the way that they want to with the singular narrative. That's the predicament that everything's stuck in. And I don't know what the answer is because try and talk to scientists about this, and what they say is, "Oh, you're trying to tell us we need to lie." It's not lying, it's information structuring and strategy. And I don't know, it just goes on and on. I think I've been labeled by a lot of people as the guy who's trying to encourage Hollywood lying from the beginning. That was the label that came out in my first book. So what can you do but just keep marching forward and having fun? And yeah, on that note, let's get going on what we're going to do today because I think this is going to be fun. And we got three little presentations to get the ball rolling, but as always, we're interested in lots more people. And then I think after myself, Matthew, and Liz go, then we've got Dean and Julie that also have some things to share. And then I think Andy Reynolds will join us at the half hour. He's got some things. Rick has got things to share. Anybody else? This is just open house as we continue to brainstorm on the narrative metrics. So that let me get going then by talking about what we're working on here. And just to kind of get everybody on same footing, this is most of you already know this, but I'll run through. In the beginning, there was the ABT model, 12, 13 years ago when I first put it together. And it is the three words and, but, therefore. One of the things that I realized early on was that I started looking at these words and but in particular, and I found a website that talked about what they were as categories, and these are conjunctions and is a word of agreement, and but is a word of contradiction, and then eventually figured out therefore is a word of consequence. So these are the three forces of agreement, contradiction, and consequence. So that's where at the core of everything, that's the most important dynamic to be aware of. Agreement, contradiction, consequence. This is how we use narrative all day long. And this is where Jerry Graff we had on a few months ago. And he knows that his book, They Say, I Say, is just the same thing. It's agreement and contradiction. They say it's agreement, contradiction is I say. So we're all in agreement on those are the forces. And then when you start taking a look at these forces, here's what you realize with the action. So once again, it's almost like this is the genotype, these three forces, agreement, contradiction, and consequence. This is the very deepest of all levels, like the genotype, think of it in those terms. And then these words are the outward expression of them. In our language, this is the word that we use to express agreement. This is the one we use to express contradiction. This is one word that's used for consequence. Now, here's where it gets interesting. When you take a look at, there's a bunch of websites that will give you the list of the 100 most commonly used words in the English language. There's a little bit of variation among them, but there's some pretty clear patterns. And here's one that I just this morning grabbed. Um, and here's what you see in every one of these lists. The word and is in the top 3 to 5 words most commonly used. So there it is in this list. The, be, to, or, and, the five most common words according to this survey. And then there's a Wikipedia page that gives you their own list. I think they have and at number 3. So what that shows you there is without a doubt, and is the word you want to be going to first and foremost to try and look at agreement, quantifying agreement within a text. And there aren't any other significant words of agreement on this list here. So when there's another sites that give you all most common words of agreement, and there are things like also and additional and adding to that, who knows what. There's other words of agreement. None of them are on this list of the top 100. So it's obvious that and is the word you want to work with to try and quantify ABT dynamics for that first element. Then you take a look at the word of contradiction, and up here you see but. And we know there's other words of contradiction. However, despite yet we've talked about that from the very beginning. And by the way, I've got 12 to 15 years of thinking about this. So a lot of people lately are bringing up questions that I was considering 12, 13 years ago. Um, and so in terms of the word of contradiction, yes, there are all these other words of contradiction, but you look there and but is usually somewhere between 15 and 25 most common words. So in this one, each of those colored lists is 20, increments of 20. So you see it's there at number 22 is the word but. There's no other words of contradiction in the top 100 there. And so, however, is not in that top 100. It just isn't used that much. And we've quantified this a lot. And in the New Yorker, for example, it's about 2% of the usage of but. So, but is the go-to word for everybody communicating. Now, we see some of these quirks that happen with scientists. There are some scientists who are just programmed in their brain, I think, to use however instead of but. And we know there's a diplomacy element to however. So we do see it occasionally, outliers using it a bunch, but overall, it's not used very much. So those are the two words that are very common, and that's why we choose them when it comes time to try and do some metrics, is because they are the ones that are really common and recurring. Now, the third one, sometimes people say we need to also include and quantify the consequence word, but that just ain't that easy, and for a number of different reasons. So the first thing to say about why it isn't that easy is something I've noticed going back 30 years when I first started studying screenwriting, which is the standard structure of a story, which is kind of captured by the and but therefore, is a story begins with the setup, and then there's a first turn that happens on the word but. That's when you establish the contradiction, you establish the problem, and then there's a second turn that happens when you finally solve it, and that's the word therefore, and therefore this is the solution. That all sounds nice in theory. When you start look at actual real world storytelling, especially manifested by screenplays, you see that first, they call it the first plot point, the introduction of the tension with the word but, that tends to be razor sharp, crystal clear in almost all stories. The story goes along boringly, and then they open up a door and there's a dead body in a single instance. You go from the blue to the red there. And so that's really consistent and easily quantified. Going from the red to the green, the end of the second act, when you get to the third part, when you watch movies, it's really vague. It's really hard. I've been in courses where we've tried to pinpoint where is that second plot point. Lots of different things are happening by then, and it's often a slow gradation. And the bottom line is that the therefore is nowhere near as clear and as easily quantified to begin with. And then when we take a look at the word itself, you see that people don't use the word therefore in common parlance much at all. It's a weird, clunky word. It's very powerful. And so in a conversation, if you really want to get everybody's attention, therefore, it's got a lot of power to it. But as we know, the word that's used much more commonly is the word so, and that you see there is at number 31 in the list. The problem, though, is that so is a modifier, and it's used more commonly as so big, so long, so much, all those sorts of things. And so it just doesn't have nearly as tightly connected narrative structural value as the other words do. Another thing to go back that's interesting, looking at those top 5 words in the green, um, the 4 out of those 5 words are meaningless. The doesn't have any meaning by itself, be, to, or, and most people assume that and is just as meaningless. That's the whole story in the World Bank thing. That's what happened when Paul Romer, the chief economist, put out the memo saying we're now going to reduce the usage of the word and. All the people there knew nothing about narrative structure, didn't know that there was anything unique about and to them, it was the same as putting out a memo saying we're now going to reduce the usage of the word the. And that would make sense to rise up against that. Of all the stupid things, who cares how many thes we have in our memos? But and is different. And is connected with this narrative structure as we see with the ABT. So that's the whole long background on why we choose these words, try and quantify. And interestingly, you see in the top 100 is also because, which is one of our words in the secondary level of the the template. So, okay, that's the choice of the words to get clear on that for everybody. And now we take a look at the two metrics themselves. And I pulled these together in probably 2013 or 14, I guess, as I was starting to write the Houston We Have a Narrative book. Um, for about 10 years, I kind of limped along running them by people, and no one ever really got in deep and began to scrutinize, are these really two valuable metrics? 5 years ago with Matthew, about 4 years ago with the ABT course, we began to use them and exercise in the course, and that forced him to start scrutinizing them. And he began to catch fire and say back to me, you know what? There's actually a lot of interesting stuff with these two metrics. And then since then, we've grown it a little bit. And then starting in January, we started pushing it a lot. And now this group has been really wonderful. And there's a number of people who aren't here yet with us or may not make it today, but we're recording this and they're going to watch it as well. And this is a discussion I want to continue to have these sessions on because this is at the heart and soul of everything that we're doing. Okay, so when it comes to these two metrics, I'm going to lay out in a moment. There's two elements that we're involved in here. First of which is gathering the data, and then the second of which is the interpretation of what it means. We're not interested in any argument about the data because it's so objective. We've gone with the simplest of things, just counting butts and ands. That's all that we're doing pretty much. So there's no arguing with that other than whether those are the right words. That's why I just made the whole case for that. That's not where the focus needs to be. The focus is once we see these patterns, and that's what we're interested in, is when you see a pattern, then it's time to start being a scientist and say, what's going on here? Why is there this pattern? What's behind it? That's where the world starts to get, that's real science, where the world starts to get interesting. And why there are so many people devoid of curiosity that don't see any reason to dig deeper on, for example, this optimal value for the and frequency we'll talk about in a minute. It baffles me. Okay, so now let's get into the two metrics, and then I will finish and hand it over to Matthew, and he's going to talk about one case study, and then Liz is going to talk about the data she's been gathering the last few days, and then we'll have the other folks as well. So here we go. The first metric is simply the and frequency. It couldn't be any simpler. You take a document, and all you're doing is counting the total number of words, and then how many instances are there of the word and divide the two. So it's the percentage of the total words are the word and. So for example, if you have a document and you count 23 ands and the document happens to be exactly 1,000 words, then your and frequency will be 2.3%. And that's what we do with that one. Couldn't be simpler. The other metric is this, the narrative index is what we've labeled it. And this brings in the power of contradiction now, buts to ands. And same thing, all you do is count all the buts, count all the ands, and divide the two, and then we multiply it by 100 to make it into a whole number. I have Bill Dennison to thank for that 13 years ago, and he started helping me out on the stuff. He came up with that thing about let's make this easier instead of working with fractions, let's make a whole numbers. So that's been very helpful. In terms of why is it butts over ands over butts, or why is ands even in there? There's at least four different science colleagues of mine from the old days that I've worked with who are very good on statistics. And they've all rummaged through this and thought it through. And in the end said, you know, there's other things you do, but this is as good as anything. So there's really, I think it's pretty well thought through, this being a valid metric. And it could be ands over butts, but we choose butts to ands. Okay. Now, two ways in which these two metrics differ in their dynamics. And this is Matthew. Is Brian with us? I don't think he's joining us. Okay, but Brian
Yep.
Hamilton, one of our longtime buddies, yesterday wrote an email and said that he's having a hard time with the fact that the two parameters are different in their dynamics. And here's how they differ. So the and frequency, this simple question, is there an optimum? Yes. This is what is amazing with the and frequency. And I swear, if it's the last thing I ever do, I'm going to get these linguistics people somehow interested in firing up some curiosity about there is this thing in the world, 2.5%, this magic number. Why doesn't it feel magical to you? Oh, well, 2.5%. I've been through on and on and on with trying to generate interest in that. They should. Everybody's interested in pi. Everybody's interested in, um, the golden angle. Everybody's interested in the 0.75 metabolic scaling exponent. There are these unique numbers out in the world, and this is one of them, 2.5%. Why is it that when you look at all these articles in the New Yorker and calculate this, they converge really clearly when there are good editors involved? They get it right down to 2.5%. And actually, Michael Rayner, one of the members of our group, a couple months ago, dove into the internet and found a bunch of other very obscure websites that do cite that 2.5%, but they don't really go into any explanation. And if you ask me, this is something I think every single person who's involved in trying to write and communicate information with a message needs to know and needs to be attested. And we're going to do this. I'm sorry. We've got the device now. That's what this whole session is about. And now it's just a matter of getting people out there to start using this and find a way to propagate it. That there's no excuse now to not be looking at every document you write and instantly run it through this. So yes, there's an optimum. Then we take a look at the narrative index. And in the beginning, 12, 13 years ago, when I first started doing this, I just thought more is better. A couple months ago, we did our little mini symposium, and I think it was Andy Reynolds. Was it Andy, Matthew, who questioned whether
Yeah,
or not,
yeah.
when you start to get way up there in this narrative index, when it starts to score in the 30s and 40s, are we sure that's better than down the 20s? And I think he was the first one to really push me on that. And my answer is maybe, maybe not. Maybe when you get too much contradiction in there, um, even if it's only with the word but, you're starting to confuse people. We're still working on that, but that's a fundamental difference in these two. All along, we thought it was just a linear scale. The more is better for the narrative index. And then the other way to look at them is just, for example, what do you consider to be a bad score? And this is the problem. They go in opposite directions. So a bad score for the and frequency is to have a really high score. It means you've got a lot of ands and you're boring people. A bad score for the narrative index is to have a very low narrative index, means you've got very few buts and you're not firing people's brains with contradiction. And it means that the two parameters are going opposite directions. That makes it challenging to plot and to explain to people. This is part of what was throwing Brian yesterday, and I understand. And so both of these things are complications here, the optimum and that. So, okay, and now here's what the big development of the past year. My good buddy Alistair Trotter, who is AI metrics superstar, incredibly sharp guy, part of my tennis group for the last 5 years, has a master's degree in physics from Oxford. And he set to work just a week or so ago with the ABT, and he, using Claude, came up with this simple thing we've labeled now the ABT-ometer. And you go to our website here, abtnarrative.com, and click on that red text up there, and it takes you to this. And this is the ABT-ometer, and it's something we've been needing. We've had a few versions of this, but we've never had it put together as quickly and simply. And also, it can handle any size text. And so here it is. All you do is just copy and paste your text right down there where it says enter your text, put it in there, and there's a button below that. You click that, and then it outputs your scores. And that's it. And so in an instant, you can copy and paste, copy, paste, and click. I guess it's three things: copy, paste, click. God, we probably should put that, Matthew, up at the top.
Oh,
Three
copy,
things.
paste, click. That's
Yeah,
perfect.
copy,
Okay,
paste,
yeah.
click. That's it.
Is
That's
what
all
I've
you got to
been
do.
doing for the last several days.
Yes, let's make it as simple as possible. Copy, paste, click. There you go. That's part of what we're doing here for this hour, is trying to think of more ways to make this more functional and usable. And so that's now the device. That's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to hand it over now to Matthew. Give us a little 2 to 3 minute quick presentation on how you've used the metrics, because now we want to talk about why do we think this is valuable and useful. So let's see. Take it away, Matthew.
Sure. First off, Randy, are we saving questions for the end, or are we okay to start taking
Um,
some now?
let's take them now. Somebody got a question?
Richard had a question about the amp frequency you want to
Yeah,
ask.
yeah. Let's clarify things as we go along if we can. Yes.
Yeah, I had a simple question. If the and frequency is too high, sometimes it's just a case of run-on sentences.
Hmm.
And so if you simply break it into simpler sentences, you haven't really changed, I want to say the narrative, but you can reduce the and frequency a bit. Can it be as simple as that?
Yeah, it is. A lot of what this is about, and again, let's definitely take these questions and keep the discussion going. We're not on any tight schedule on this. When we get to Liz, you're going to see she's going to talk about two famous authors, and it's an artistic technique to use the word "and." The day was long, and the water was still, and the people were out in numbers. Um, and so you get that as an artifact. So it starts to lead in the world of art. But what we're here working on is not art by any means. We're here to try and figure out how to communicate information more effectively. And it means that and is, I don't know if it's an impediment when you're talking about it like this example you are, but what I do know, I think it's pretty tightly correlated to other variables. That means that when you're starting to see a high end frequency, there's probably a bunch of other things going on. The person's just not thinking narratively. And
Yeah.
if they were bringing in an editor, because that's what an editor does, they come in and they spot, look at all these ands and they start pulling them out and reducing that. So, does that make sense in terms of the and being the functionality of it? And there are a lot of exceptions to what we're talking about here, but our key strategy here is to keep it with these two simple metrics that, and then see the clear patterns that come out of them. And they are the metrics are accurate but not precise. And so, for example, Liz was doing, frequency narrative index for some authors yesterday, and some of the plots were just a little bit of bumping up and down, and you could try and tell stories about them. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in the night and day differences. I'm interested in the Lincoln Douglas debate where Lincoln had double the narrative index of Douglas. When it's that drastic, you can be sure that it's that accurate, and it is. And then something's going on there, and that's where we want to get into the interpretation element. So, okay, if there's not any other
Thank you.
questions, then Matthew, take it away. And yeah, let's take 2 or 3 minutes here to run through a little case study.
Sure, sure. So, yeah, Randy asked me to come up with a case study of a time that I was able to actually use these metrics in a more practical sense, and this one instantly popped to mind. The time I got to play a narrative doctor out on the East Coast. So I had flown out to do a workshop for one of the largest consulting firms on the East Coast, and the workshop was going pretty well. People seemed to be getting it. It was moving right along. But about halfway through the day, one of the organizers came up to me and said, Matthew, could you please take a look at this memo for me? This is a memo that is our vision, all the managers in this room, our vision of what the company is going to look like in 5 years' time. And we are super excited about it. We think it's this beautiful, wonderful vision of who we want to be and who we are and where we're going. And we find this extremely motivational. And we're expecting everyone else outside of this room to find it extremely motivational as well. But there is just one problem with this memo. Everyone outside this room absolutely hates it, and we're not sure why. That includes the workers below us who say that they cannot make heads or tails of this memo, and the VP above us who says, and I quote, this memo does not connect with me at all. Can you help us? So I took a look at it as the narrative doctor and ran my little diagnosis. And the first thing that I did was, of course, run it through the metrics. And lo and behold, what do you think I saw? I saw what is possibly one of the most non-narrative documents I have ever seen before in my entire life.
And how many words total was it?
It was just under 1,000. So, didn't quite hit the full 1,000 sample size, but I mean, we see enough right here, right? Like, there was not a single word of contradiction in the entire thing. There was no buts, there was no howevers, there was no yets, there was no excepts, there was no despites. There was not a single problem in the entire thing. So of course that's why it's not like resonating with anyone. Like it makes complete sense. So I had my little prescription for them. We kind of like rearranged the last half of the day. There were 5 sections of this memo, so we broke all the managers into groups of 5 and had them work on each section to try to add in a problem, to try to add in narrative. And once again, all the managers were like, oh, well, this will be easy. We know what all the problems are. Well, this will just take us a few minutes. around a half hour in, what they found was this was not easy whatsoever, as they were like beating their heads against the wall. There'd be five people in a group, and what they found was that they would have five different ideas of what the problem was. And by the time they nailed it down to one problem, they're like, oh God, this is going to change our setup and our solution. Ugh. But at the very end, after they pushed through it all, what several of them said when they came up to me afterwards was, we understand this better. Like, we thought we understood it before, but what we actually had was like a false consensus. We didn't really understand the problem. We didn't understand the steps we had to take. And it was only through working through this that we finally got down to what it is we're actually trying to say and what it is we're actually trying to do. So, moral of the story, don't forget to take your daily dose of narrative, or you will get a visit from the
Well,
narrative.
that was excellent. And one last little second here. Why don't you tell us the term that you came up with a couple months ago that has now become fundamental in our whole lexicon, which is the midweek blues? Can you tell us in 2 or 3 sentences what that means?
Yes, and that's exactly what they hit. It wasn't the midweek blues, it was the mid-hour blues. So people will come into our ABT mini course at the beginning like, "Oh, ABT setup problem solution, this stuff is easy." And it's usually around Wednesday at the halfway mark when everyone's like, "I don't understand this. I don't understand narrative. I'm completely lost." And yeah, we absolutely hit that during the workshop too. But it's part of the hero's journey. It's the darkest hour moment. It's the descent into the underworld, and then you have to
And
drag
and
yourself out.
and and this crops up a lot with the stuff that we do, which is that sometimes we start with a really analytical term that nobody can connect with, and then you hit on that thing
Dunning-Kruger.
that's
Yeah.
broader and simpler. And so, yeah, we've been for years talking about Dunning-Kruger, and nobody gets Dunning-Kruger. I'm sorry. I know it's cool and it's groovy, yada yada yada, but midweek blues, everybody gets it, and that's in an instant when you said it that day, like that's what we've been needing. Some of these things, it's like what I did with nested ABTs. Nobody really quite got that other than highly analytical scientists. And then the New York Times referred to the same thing as a story built of stories. That's more broader and experiential. So that was excellent. Thank you very much. So let's move on to Liz. We got another quick little thing like that for us, and then we'll be ready to start chewing on these things a little bit. Go for it, Liz.
For sure. So, while I get the share going. So, you guys, if you guys have been following the narrative knockdown, Randy has had me tasked with going through and burying myself in metrics. So, this week I ended up going into my two personal favorite authors. So, we're going to look at some of those numbers because, yeah, this has been me for like the last several weeks, and I love it. I love it. So we're looking at two of my personal favorite authors, who are J.R. Tolkien and Michael Crichton. Very different authors, but both very prolific, very popular. And specifically for this, I was looking at the Lord of the Rings and the Jurassic Park books. So in total, Lord of the Rings is 64 chapters long, and Jurassic Park is 61. Now, just to clarify, by chapters, we are not referring to a specific quantitative value. And just as a note, I'm including introductions, prologues, and epilogues in this, but I did not count the appendices. We are ignoring that. So, but 64 chapters for Tolkien and 61 for Jurassic Park. Now, right off the bat, the average and frequency for Tolkien came in at a whopping 4.2%. This is covering all of the Lord of the Rings. While for Crichton, Jurassic Park comes in at a solid 2.4%. So very different there. And then going a little bit further into the total number of chapters coming in at under 3% on the and frequency. For Tolkien, that is a grand total of one chapter under 3% and frequency. And in fact, it's a 2.9. Meanwhile, for Crichton, that number of chapters is 51 out of his 61 chapters. So most of Jurassic Park, chapter by chapter, is under 3% in and frequency. Meanwhile, over 3%, well, in Tolkien's case, the other 63 chapters are all over 3%, going as high as 6.8% in one particular chapter, but all over 3%. And in Crichton's case, 10 chapters over 3%. His highest one was a 5.4 on and frequency. So where that leaves us is And kind of the key thing I took away from this was how very, very different they are in their writing styles, as shown here. And, where Tolkien is very, very bulky, very lots of prose, lots of descriptors, big use of and. Crichton, he's very sparse in his use of and. So, and knowing both of them, and I've loved both of them as writers for a very, very long time, most of my life, I'm not surprised by this at all. So, but it does leave more questions of what does it mean and where do we go from here with this? And yes.
Randy, you are muted.
Oops. Nice. Okay.
5 years of practice and you still
Exactly.
haven't.
Lecturing to myself. Okay. No, let me just add in there that Crichton was legendary for being really bad at character development. His books were insulted and criticized as being made up of stick figures running here and there, and we hardly knew who anybody was. That is all. Character development is part of exposition, part of setup, and it involves the word and. And so this is not at all surprising that the guy that was really bad at that sort of stuff, his books were so strong for pacing and action and things like that. And so he just dispensed with all the description and just got in there, made things gallop along. Whereas Tolkien, I think, is known for creating great, memorable characters and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting. There's a lot of information that we can see from this right off the bat. The question is whether I can find anybody in the literary world or the linguistics world or any other profession that takes an interest in this. And in today's world of too much information, where everybody's gotten so channelized, it's just about impossible to interest people in other disciplines unless you're in their club. And I've told this before about Richard Lanham, who wrote a wonderful book, The Economics of Attention. And I had lunch with him a year or so after it came out. And I said, "Why isn't your book a bestseller?" He said, "Because I'm an English professor and my book is about communication." And he said, "I couldn't get anybody in any communication society organizations to even read it, review it, talk about it." This is the silo thing that we talk about. It is so profound, and it's what I've been through with all this sort of stuff. ABT, we're making some progress bit by bit. It's almost like we're some radical group that has to meet in people's basements or something. And that's what this is us scheming on how someday we will enlighten the world on this, because it's pretty profound at that point. And it hasn't been out there because it only began in '86 with Frank Daniel spotting this three-word dynamic. 2011 jumped up with the South Park guys mentioning it on TV. And it's 14 years since then of me developing this and trying to propagate it. So let's see. Andy, did you want to quickly share with us the thing you sent me this morning? I thought that was very cool. Can you do that one pretty quickly?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I shared with Randy and Matthew earlier that I recently have been completely impressed with, of all things, a three-hour presentation about ADHD. And to me, the mesmerizing thing about this presentation, which I'll put in a link to in the chat, is the speaker, who is a researcher, psychiatrist or psychologist, works with kids and families who are dealing with the ADHD. He speaks for 3 hours on the disability or about ADHD and never says never says He has astounding fluency. It's as if a well-edited, tightly scripted narrative is just coming off the top of his head, no pauses. I'll put the link to the link or to the video in the chat. I do commend it to everybody. Even if you're not interested in the underlying subject matter on child psychiatry, et cetera, it is nevertheless a tour de force of just a guy with deep expertise just talking and never saying I am a huge fan of the ABT metrics. And so when I was just a few minutes into this video, I said to myself, all right, this guy rocks. He's very good. An incredibly fluid and astoundingly talented communicator. I wonder how his ABT metrics are. And they turned out to be pretty good. Randy and Matthew have clued us in that 25, narrative index of 25 may be the sweet spot. Sure enough, this guy, over at least the first hour of his 3 hours of talking, his first 65 minutes, he clocks in at a 25 narrative index. quite remarkable. I'll put the links in the chat. And I do commend the presentations
And
to
what about
everyone.
the and frequency?
Pretty low. He was somewhere around 3, as I recall. And frequency, yeah, 3.1. So 3.1 and frequency, 25 narrative index, so right there. And that is across 10,300 words. So this is a guy just talking for an hour and 5 minutes, over 10,000 words, seemingly off the top of his head. And he's right there at a 3.1 and frequency and a 25 narrative index. A most impressive communicator.
Yeah, it's as if there exists a sort of editor brain, um, that people have got a brain, and clearly great editors have got that. And that's why the New York Times and New Yorker articles converge on 2.5% stunningly consistently, is that brain, whatever the rules are that are programmed in that brain, and I don't think any of these people analytically know what they're doing. And, they just do what they do. And at the end of the day, then you'd run the diagnostics, and lo and behold, there it is. They land on that 2.5% in particular. And then the ones that are good communicators are usually in the 20s, exactly like that. That's really fascinating. Wow. Let's see. Dean, did you have something you wanted to toss in?
Sure. So, I mean, Andy got to give a really, really nice good news piece, and I get to do the flip side. A few days ago, our vice president, I work in a natural history museum, our vice president for research and collection sent us a document, forwarded us a document that about to help us all communicate about biodiversity. I thought, yeah, great. It's from Annenberg Center for Climate Journalism and Communication. This is going to be cool.
And wait,
Um,
wait a second. Wait a second. When you forwarded that document to me, what did you title your email?
so I read that document, and my first reaction and my title when I forwarded it to Randy was "Why We Fail." Um,
And I forwarded it to a ton of people. Exactly.
so I opened up this document, and it is a poster child for two things. One is why we are failing at climate communication. Number two, the metrics work on this document. So I will put the link for the document itself into the chat in a moment. But the metrics on this one are and frequency of 4%, narrative index 4. And this is all about how to communicate effectively from professional Annenberg School communicators. It's a kind of a nightmare. I want to commend Randy, actually, in particular, for having some serious industrial cleaning of his house, because his brains were spattered all over the wall there. So, good job on the cleanup, Randy.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, I will quote two quotes that are illustrative. On page 2, it says, I quote, "Bringing attention to any issue in 2025 can prove to be challenging. Here are just a few solutions to help you get started. So problem 1, not one message. We're going to start with 12 or 14 things that you can think about. So that's, item 1. And then example here, page 5, point number 3. We're on point number 3 here. For example, instead of saying loss of bees can lead to ecosystem collapse, say that loss of bees can reduce the growth of fruits, vegetables, and flowers such as apples, avocados, and nuts, which can endanger the animals that rely on them." Replete with examples like this that are the antithesis of what we, I think, here are learning in our messaging here. So I will share the link with you, but it is shared with the caveat that this is something you want to isolate from every other written thing that you deal with and keep in a
And
nice
the
little
one that drove me
enclave
crazy
somewhere.
was their second point was avoid oversimplification. As
Oh
though
yeah.
as though that is like the major objective is, make sure you don't. It's easy to avoid oversimplification. The challenge is, can you take your complicated pile of garbage and boil it down to something simple enough that somebody can walk away with a message? And why they're not preaching that, I mean, what is this? Are these people overpaid, overfed? They feel no urgency in the world, and they're producing these things that don't convey urgency. I mean, this is the nightmare, and it would be one thing if it was 20 years ago where you had to say, well, someday there might be a price to be paid for this, but it's not. It's 2025, and the price is in the news every single day now as the academic world is collapsing. And by the way, Kent, if you don't mind for just 1 minute, you and I were trading emails last couple of days about this. I mean, What do you think? Oh, are you
Yeah, I don't know what I think. I
Oh,
mean, I want to be hopeful,
there?
but it's hard.
Yeah.
I,
Is there any urgency on your campus of we're doing something wrong here and we're about to go extinct?
Um, I, well, on at UConn, my perception, and keep in mind I'm retired now, so I'm less connected than I used to be.
Yeah.
But I would say at the University of Connecticut, there is a real sense of urgency with respect to the state budget situation and how that's affecting our budget. Um, but in general, and faculty are sort of personally worried about all of the attacks that are happening on higher ed, whether it's at Columbia or Harvard or canceling NIH grants or whatever. But I am not aware that there's sort of concerted action of any sort to respond to that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We've had a few little moments of joy. For example, in the spring, the folks at FAA in New Jersey, their Aviation Research Center, got in touch with exactly that urgency, and they said, "We've got crises unfolding here, and we more than ever need to tell our story effectively." And we've been working with them all year long, and we're about to run the mini course with them next month. And they've been wonderful. I mean, this is it all. It's just like AA, you know, you can't help people until they admit they have a problem. That's what they say in AA. It all begins by saying, I accept I'm an alcoholic. I have a problem. And unfortunately, so much of the science community does not admit they have a problem, i.e., this document that Dean's just talked about that has nothing about that. Julie, you want to jump in with some thoughts?
Yeah, and this is actually what I found when I was looking at some of the doing some of the analysis is that, and I get this argument a lot. It's like we have to give hope. We have to focus on the
Yes,
optimism. And
yes.
I think that is at the cost of stating, of really dropping a butt bomb or softening, softening the problem.
Yeah, well, I will give my horrible assessment of that, which is from the beginning, I've said there's so much of the blind leading the blind when it comes to science communication. And so many of these
oh,
people running these workshops, they just don't know how to communicate to begin with, and they lock onto something like that, like, oh, we've got to give hope first and foremost. Surely, yes.
I'm an optimist. I mean, quite frankly, if I had not been an optimist, I'd probably be dead right now because the kinds of stressors that have formed my life are those that contribute to high blood pressure, to every other kind of thing that can kill you. The point is that we are taught in so many cases that we have to talk like scientists, and that means all of the nuance, all of the kind of complexity has to be introduced. Otherwise, we are dumbing it down.
Yeah.
And we have been really beaten over the head about dumbing things down, as though we expect that our audiences are going to come in at a particular level. And there is a belief, unfortunately, that you cannot have clear and accurate operating at the same time with regard to the way you deal with the science. That clear means that there's a lot of like little subtleties or whatever it is that you're going to drop off. And accurate means that you put all that stuff in. But since no one understands it, who cares if you're accurate or not?
Yeah.
There is a plain language writing style that is operative for people who are reading, for example, below like an eighth grade level. And people who work in literacy programs often take those classes in order to be able to write things that are both clear and accurate. And we tried that at AAAS in terms of some books that we put out called The Science Inside. And it was the science inside of whatever it is, you name it. But the point was, how do you talk about this with people who may be coming in with a sixth grade reading level, who are not necessarily going to be able to handle all of the subtleties and the nuances and what have you. I think that we get our audiences wrong. We don't understand that it isn't just a matter of um, the political world, but our presidents, our donors, and I've said that to faculty. I said, you've got to talk to the people who have the least amount of understanding of your core work. Now, how do you explain your stuff to them? And I do think they get the audience wrong.
Well, and as you know, I will say over and over again, the only long-term hope at any broad level is this simple dynamic of setup problem solution, and which is what the ABT is. That's the one way you can reach every single different level. At least gives you a model to try and think in terms of. And I'm sorry, I know Alan Alda was a wonderful guy. All he tried to do for science communication. But over and over again, he would say, look, it's as simple as think of yourself as like you're trying to explain this to your grandmother or to, a 4-year-old or something. That doesn't give you any guidance. Okay, how do I explain it to my grandmother in a way that makes sense? And the answer is you revert back to this simple structure of setup, problem, solution as a starting point and then radiate from there. Andy, you got a comment?
Yeah, I was just wondering, has anybody ever done a crosswalk or an analysis comparing narratively strong texts to their reading ease? And by reading ease, I mean the Flesch-Kincaid meter that is available in Microsoft Word. I just copy and pasted the Annenberg document into Word, and I got roughly 3,400 words, a Flesch-Kincaid grade level of 16.8. So if I do the math, if high school seniors, 12th grade, this is graduate level writing. So this is graduate. You have to have already gone through 4 years of undergrad,
Yeah.
according to Microsoft Word, to understand this stuff. And that just brings to mind, has anybody ever looked at narratively strong texts and related that to Flesch-Kincaid reading ease? I would note that ADH researcher, who's one of 3 hours I transcribed and told you about, his first 65 minutes clocks in at an 8th grade reading level.
Yeah,
so I think there may be a correlation between easy reading and narrative strength.
Well, and we're in our last 5 minutes here, but let me toss on another thing, what you said. The thing that I do with my personal hobby horse with a report like that is I have these two little lists of pet words that I search for their words and my words. My words are simplicity, intuition, narrative, and I searched all of my words in that document and they came out at 0. There was one mention of the word story and one storytelling, but other than that, nothing. Then their words start with framing had 10 mentions, values had 14 mentions, and cognitive, I think, had a few mentions. Those are their words. It's all drawing on the world of psychology and puts it up there, what you're saying, up in the graduate student level stuff. They all want to impress each other with the sophistication of what they have to say. And they're not
That's my
thinking,
point.
yes, they're not thinking in practical terms whatsoever. And it's revealed by that, among other things. And I did the same thing with National Academy of Science about 10 years ago, came out with this big thing on how to communicate science broadly. It's a 50-page report. It was horrible. And I searched that. I've got a blog post. I'll bring it next time, share it with everybody. The exact same thing there. Cognition, perception, values, all this psychology lingo, all through their dumb thing, and nothing on the practical side. And again, I mean, nobody buys a solution without a problem. They really, I don't think at a deep level feel that there's a genuine problem there. Their problem is just trying to impress each other with their level of intellectual sophistication, I guess. I don't know. It's pretty sad. We got 3 minutes left. This has been a tremendous session. Julie, wrap up comment, and we'll just pick this up next week because we got so much more to go on this. This is our working group. I can't thank you enough for doing this. Julie.
Yeah, just to highlight on what Shirley was saying, because I think this is how when I did the analysis on what I was looking at, first I started, who's my audience? And then what's the purpose? What do I want the audience to feel? And then when I looked at my scores, then I could understand where I was falling down or whether I was, was meeting my purpose. And on some of these, the purpose was, I want to drive home this point that this is a crisis. This is and the scores were really weak. So that was pretty fascinating for, just looking at it from that aspect. But it was really all about who am I talking to and what do I want them to feel?
Yeah, and I'll finish with the quote from Dave Gold, the guy who co-authored the politics book with me, who had the professor who said, for example, in political campaigns, um, you have to have a Christmas tree. You've got all these issues. Issues are like ornaments, and they're great. You got a box full of ornaments, but you've got to have that central structure. That's what the ABT is. You've got to have that narrative structure on which you can hang these ornaments. And if you don't have the structure, then you end up like we were talking a little while ago about, somebody having 16 different ornaments for you to consider in communication. You got to have that structure, and it takes a lot of time to find the structure. But as the people that work with us have these breakthrough moments, realize when you finally crack the nut. And Matthew, why don't you give us the final word on that dynamic, the Liz moment, and finding the structure and what happens to people. And we're getting that now with our 1 week mini course that is starting to propagate itself. We've got a bunch of groups now that we're doing it with in the fall, and including the FAA groups. But that week concludes on Friday with the kind of synthesis session where everybody gets to look at their first draft compared to their fifth draft. And is it not in that moment that they get hit by bingo? It works, right?
Yeah. It's a real sense of closure there at the end. They get to see the entire journey from beginning to end. And they get to appreciate, oh yeah, I did have that midweek blues moment there in the middle, but I came out of it and I was able to make something that I can now use. And that's one of the things I love about the ABT mini course. It gives them the journey, it gives them the practice, and it gives them something practical that they can take out of it and go off and create.
Excellent. Okay, and did you put the link to the ABT-ometer in the chat window if you haven't?
I did.
Okay, and everybody share that with all your friends and go to work for the next week. And let's do another session like this next week because we got lots more to share and to cogitate on this. It's very, very productive. And I think this is a potential tipping point for us that I'm getting a lot of emails from people who are now taking this simple tool. And what did we say? Copy, paste, and click.
Copy, paste, click.
That's it. All right, that's our big breakthrough for this week. So thanks, everybody. This is an excellent session, and everybody come back next week. See you then. Bye-bye.